the Proud Tower was about to fall. And the Proud Tower, as I said, was the moral Christian view of the world. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about Nietzsche's specific terms that he uses and so forth. But let's go back first a little bit and look at what made Nietzsche Nietzsche. What is Nietzsche's intellectual legacy? Not legacy, but so much. What is his intellectual linkage? Nietzsche was not trained as a philosopher per se, though being a product of the German universities at the time, he obviously studied philosophy. In Germany, one would read Kant in high school. Then one would even do that now, perhaps. I remember a story when I went to Germany on a German government research grant during the summer in the 1970s, and it was 3 months, and I lived in a boarding house with a young redhead sweet girl who was very interested in what I was doing, and I told her I had done my doctoral dissertation on Kant, and she looked at me like I was a celebrity. And, this girl was 17. They don't call it high school; they call it gymnasium. But she was just like, "Oh, I could have been Mick Jagger," as far as she was concerned. I said, "Well, why are you so interested in this? I didn't think somebody your age would take an interest in Kant." She says, "Oh yeah, we read Kant in high school. We talked about it and everything. Everybody knows Kant here." Well, of course, Kant was the dominant intellectual presence. He was the true specter of all German culture. The great 19th century was the grand era of neo-Kantianism, with its focus on moral life and moral obligation and the kind of civil society and civic, mutual responsibility that everybody has, because we live in what Kant called a community of ends. And the whole ideal, in many ways, of social democracy in post-1848 Germany was to create this sense of the moral life that everybody shared in, both in the privacy of their home, through the family, and through moral education, or Ausbildung, as they call it, that is the building out of one's life. Or, in the creation of institutions of mutual accountability. Ultimately, it was an authoritarian society, but it was an authoritarian political structure based on this Kantian notion of duty and obligation. Okay? So that's what Nietzsche is really attacking in terms of his immediate experience when he describes the moral Christian view of the world. But Nietzsche was trained in ancient Greek philology. How many of you know what philology is? Anyone here tell me what philology means? Flow. Philology. It sounds like philosophy.
It's a lot of words.
A lot of words, yeah. It's a study of word origins and word meanings, but it's also the study of kind of the context in which words develop and so forth. So there's a kind of, social anthropology that goes along. And that's what Nietzsche was trained in. That's what Nietzsche, in his first and only real academic job that he had at the University of Basel, taught. Well, Nietzsche didn't sit very well there, but he didn't like the academic life. He certainly didn't like his colleagues, even though he was known as a kind of precocious young genius, and he had been recruited there almost to beg to teach there because of his emerging reputation. But he quit. And he quit for reasons that he considered health reasons. He spent the rest of his life as a kind of wanderer and a recluse, hanging out, especially in the summers, in Switzerland, in a city called Sils Maria, which is sort of a contemporary Nietzsche pilgrimage site, wandering in the mountains, and it was during the mountains he had some of his great poetic visions and his philosophical raptures. And in many ways, Nietzsche's whole intellectual temperament was formed by the study of the ancient Greeks. And Nietzsche made a discovery that in many ways changed the course of Western intellectual history for the time. The birth of postmodernism was in some ways tied directly through Nietzsche to his own philological training in which we might call a sort of romantic ancient sense of archaeology and anthropology. Now you understand that the 19th century was the era where the Germans were obsessed with the Greeks. They were obsessed particularly with classical ideals, not the pure sterile ideals, say, of late Baroque and early 18th century classicism, but what we might call a kind of expressive classicism. A classicism in which form becomes the vehicle for a profounder, deeper, hidden meaning. But we still have to, in a sense, focus on the form. This was not also in Germany. Artists like Delacroix, who wrote about heroic themes. This was an effort somehow to use classicism in such a way where classicism was putatively revived in its ancient meaning, as being something that was alive. And the Germans had this kind of fantasy that, particularly because of the high premium that was put by their people on philosophical thinking, and given the philosophical flexibility, if not lavish capabilities of the German language, that they saw themselves as somebody of the reincarnation of ancient Athens. And the new Prussian state also inherited many of these ideas. Now what Nietzsche did was he was using the new tools of textual analysis, translation, word study, but even more importantly, archaeology, which this late 19th century, given the colonial penetration of the developing world, academics from Europe were able to go to places around the world that they never would have had access before, and could, basically had free reign to do whatever they wanted. And they would dig up sites. And, with the liberation of the Greek peninsula from the Turks earlier in the 19th century, which had been a kind of, cause for celebrities, people like Lord Byron, the famous English poet, died while, hanging out, being a camp follower of the Greek rebels in the fray against the Turks. And so it was the emancipation of both the Italian peninsula and the Greeks from the Turks that opened up these sites, and the archaeologists began to pour in and study and find the old, what they call the old historic locations that are mentioned in the textbooks, and and find ways of reconstructing the past. And of course, very often it was a romantic past. Now, one of the things that archaeology was starting to do in its recovery of the ancient civilization of Greece was they found, what it was like Homeric times. And even though Homer was sort of like the classical literature of ancient Athens by the time Socrates and Plato came along, that nobody really knew much about who the Homeric Greeks were, other than what appeared in the two texts of that period, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Pottery was found. Pottery that showed kind of religious rites. It shows God, but particularly what Nietzsche was attracted to was the discovery of the evidence of this kind of native Greek god who is mentioned as a kind of danger to the Athenian polis. His name was Dionysus. If you read Euripides, the Bacchae, it's in some ways, it's a play about the dangers of Dionysus. Dionysus is this wild, destructive figure. He's, in some ways, the divine energy of chaos that we kind of let in and sort of takes things apart and leads to a kind of madness, almost an unconscious destruction. But there's this kind of celebration of the energy of Dionysus. And that's kind of implied in the very etymology of the term Dionysus. It's a kind of force of the divine that Nietzsche was attracted to. So, to make a long story short, he also discovered through his own philological studies that Dionysus was associated with the invention of music and dithyrambic poetry. And I don't want to go into what that means. It's all, for the classicists here in the audience, which are probably few and far between, if at all. But Nietzsche's first major work that came out, which we still read today, it's often read as a juvenile work, is called The Birth of Tragedy. And the birth of tragedy and the spirit of music. And what Nietzsche was trying, this is where Nietzsche comes up with a terminology. It's actually a dyad that everybody has heard in some way, and maybe in your comp lit course, if you took a comp lit course, or even in high school when you're kind of studying the history of Western civilization, you'll come across it. The distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And this was Nietzsche's terminology and distinction. It's now been, claimed by scholars to not be historically accurate. But Nietzsche had pointed to what he saw as a typology in ancient Greek civilization, the kind of underground indigenous worship of the mad god, or the god that causes madness, the god of wine. Dionysus was associated with winemaking and the drinking of wine and the orgiastic festivals that came out of it. In other words, Animal House, frat parties, that kind of thing. And he said, well, that's just as much as Greek as the kind of classical ideas we find in Aristotle's definition in poetry of what drama should be and so forth. That's the kind of civilized art of the polis, of the well-formed, politically sophisticated, armed polis. But outside the city, and this is reflected in the tension that we find in Euripides of Bacchae. Dionysus always inhabits the countryside. He is always on the edges. He represents what, say, a philosopher like Merleau-Ponty would call wild being. Think about wild being, it's always kind of insinuating itself and infiltrating the city. It takes over those who seem to be, some ways, pillars of the staid, sober, self-conscious, rationally minded community. In other words, Dionysus also, in certain ways, is the force of decadence. Now, this gets a little tricky, and we're talking about cultural analysis of cultural theories of culture, not philosophy, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with that. But Apollo was the sun god. Apollo was the son of order, or form. In other words, he was the sort of presiding deity of Greek harmony, proportion, what was known as sophrosine. Where everything kind of fits together in a rational whole, ratio in the sense that we were talking about yesterday. That there's a kind of balancing, accounting, everything according to its proper proportion and form. Which, music is based on these mathematical proportionalities. But as we know, in the history of rock and roll, you can also make music wild, you can make it instinctual, it can drive people crazy. You go back to the 1950s and all the articles that were written warning parents and magazines like Look and Better Home and Garden, perhaps, and stuff like that. I don't know what's in there, but about about the dangers of rock and roll. And of course, the dangers of rock and roll, you know, which will, you know, it arouses the what otherwise would be the well-controlled and decent, you know, sense of propriety. It arouses the sexual passions, and not even. And if you combine it with marijuana, you know, reefer madness, it can cause. You know what your kids are doing out on Saturday night. You know, they're not really going to the movie. They're off in the woods in parked cars, you know, having sexual orgies. Yeah, that was kind of the fear and fantasy of parents in the 1950s because of the introducing the Dionysian element. Well, that's kind of what the fear of the Greeks were too. But Nietzsche says, no, this is the whole of Greece is both the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And tragedy is not what it means. Tragedy is something not to be feared. Tragedy, the word tragedy comes from the Greek tragos, which means goat. The original tragedies were goat festivals. The birth of tragedy is the birth of philosophy. And in fact, to be able to see this, we see that there is this Dionysian orgiastic, let's call it energetic. I'm not going to call it instinctual. We'll wait till Freud comes into picture. But this sort of transpersonal kind of sense of reality, it's not just emotional, it's the expanding of consciousness. In other words, the 1960s, which is celebrated in music and legend, was supposedly an orgiastic time, a time of protest, but also a time of experimentation with everything from drugs to you know, indiscriminate sexuality and so forth, be-ins, love-ins, et cetera, and probably one of the most popular intellectual themes of the late 1960s was a trend called the New Dionysianism. And this is kind of when Nietzsche kind of came back into fashion intellectually in the academy. It came, and also because Nietzsche had been revived in France by Gilles Deleuze, who was sort of, you might call the philosopher of the new, you know, orgiastic sensibility. Well, I'm not going to talk about that now, we're talking about Nietzsche. But he wrote this book called Nietzsche and Philosophy that was published in France in '62, and it kind of changed everybody's attitude toward Nietzsche, who heretofore had been considered to be a kind of propagandist for Nazism. It's true that the Nazis used him that way, but Nietzsche was very contemptuous of what would later be called fascism, and of course he hated anti-Semites. So philosophy discovered what I'm going to call these orgiastic Dionysian undercurrents of philosophy now is engaged in a different kind of process that is going on before. Yesterday we talked about Marx, and Marx's famous line, philosophy heretofore has interpreted the world, the point is to change it. Nietzsche might be formulated as thus: heretofore philosophy has interpreted the world and perhaps tried to change the world. The point is to get underneath it. Now, what do we mean by get underneath it? What is Marx himself had talked about superstructure and substructure, you know, in the sense that the method of philosophy changing the world is to disclose its ideological content. It's to get underneath it by finding what's the real that underlies the illusion of the ideal. That's not what Nietzsche is really talking about. Nietzsche is interested in what might be called not the hidden, determinative, real world that projects the illusion of the ideal world, which most people confuse with the real. That's ideology. Philosophy, in a sense, has to go back into history. It has to probe into history. It has to be able to retrace the processes whereby things come into being and to identify those processes which were hidden. You know, in the same way, when you go, in other words, philosophy becomes symptomatology. Now, the word Nietzsche uses is genealogy, and most of us think of genealogy as being, well, tracing your ancestors. But anybody here ever seriously engaged in genealogy? Okay. Most people wait till they're retired or they have nothing to do in middle age and they start worrying about their own mortality, and they want to make sure that they know where they came from so they can preserve it for posterity. Nietzsche wasn't interested in that. One of his early essays, which is a very important little essay that's usually not read very much, is called it's translated as the use and abuse of history, but it's technically, it should be translated as the use and disadvantages of history. And in this essay, Nietzsche talks about the different ways we approach history. But he also has this notion of a critical history, which becomes the kind of formation of the genealogical approach. The genealogical approach is something which really became important in the genesis of contemporary postmodern philosophy, because the contemporary French philosopher who not only celebrated it, but also made it the hallmark of his own unique revolutionary approach to